This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. The West African nation of Liberia has a unique connection to the United States. The modern republic began as a settlement colony for people of African descent living in the Western Hemisphere. That history continues to impact the country's social and political environment. As votes are being counted from this week's national election, a crowded field of 20 presidential candidates await the results. With backgrounds ranging from career politician to footballer, fashion model, and former warlord, the people's choice for their next leader will impact how Liberia responds to the challenges it faces. Our guest today is watching the results with more than an academic interest. Dr. Buseh, professor and director of the PhD program at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's College of Nursing, is a native of Liberia. His research and teaching focus on social factors and policies that create health disparities between and within nations. Aaron, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, for people who may not be familiar with the history, tell us a little bit about the origins of the modern Republic of Liberia. I mean, obviously there were people there for thousands and billions of years, but the political entity that is Liberia started in 1847, right?
Yes. Well, Liberia is a small country located on the west coast of Africa. Like as you said, there is this perspective that it was founded by the free slaves, after slavery was abolished, and that many of these individuals decided to settle in Liberia and make Liberia their homeland. One of the things that I've always stressed is that there were indigenous people also living in Liberia before these free slaves, arrived. And so what you had was a government that was being ran by the American-Liberians for quite a long time until somewhere in 1980, when there was a coup d'etat. And this coup d'etat was led by an unenlisted soldier, Master Sergeant Samuel Doe, who overthrew the government, violently killed the president, and killed many of the cabinet ministers. And then Doe comes to power, and he stays in power, begin again to oppress his own people, even though he's an indigenous guy. And folks are not very happy with how the government is being ran and how things are happening. And so a civil war kind of erupted again in 1990, around 1989, 1990, led by Charles Taylor. And so what you have there is that this civil conflict lasted for roughly almost 14, 15 years. And it was brutal, it was bloody, there was so many warring factions. I mean, sometimes you will read about the different warring factions, and there were almost 5, 6 different groups fighting and killing themselves. So they just kind of pillaged the country, literally, damaged the infrastructure, killed a lot of people, caused a lot of people to flee into exile. And so what you had happening there was that Taylor, again, with the coming in of the United Nations and the Economic Community of West African States soldiers, they were able to, kind of create a buffer zone where some of the Liberians could be able to live freely for a while. And they had an election, and Taylor, again, was elected as president, even though he was the one who led the rebellion. So he stays in power, and there was another group again that was kind of brewing up and decided to push Taylor out of power. And so this fight started going on for a long period of time until they negotiated with him to leave and go in exile. He stays in exile in Nigeria for a while, and then he gets arrested and was taken to The Hague. He was judged to be guilty of war crimes against humanity because the war didn't only focus in Liberia, but it spilled over into Sierra Leone and other countries in the neighboring countries. And so he's now serving a 50 years, penalty in prison in Europe. So this election today is actually the first smooth transition, I would say, handed over from an elected government, which is the Ellen Johnson Sirleaf government that has been in power for 12 years. This is the first smooth transition of power in Liberia since its founding. So this is fascinating.
So, you touched on the role that some of these people played, and some of the people involved in the more violent period during the Civil War have made that transition into political life.
Yeah,
well, in fact, one of the presidential candidates, Prince Johnson, is a former fighter himself in one of these groups. So talk a little bit about how that happened.
Yeah. In order to, create peace, there was something almost like a peace commission group that was set up, almost similar to what you see in South Africa when apartheid was abolished, the Peace and Reconciliation Commission. So a similar kind of thing was set up. And that people who come forward and confess, that they, did some atrocities during the war will not be prosecuted. And I think this is how some of these guys managed to, not be prosecuted. But you touch on a very important point. I think for many Liberians at this point in time, if you talk to Liberians, because I'm on the phone every time talking to my folks back home, and when you talk to many of them, they will tell you, all we want is peace. We just want peace. We just want peace, So I don't know what that is about, but there's this perception that maybe if you try to prosecute everybody and try to prosecute these guys, then you will make some groups again to spring up, and then you have another conflict.
So perfect justice is the enemy of just peace for the average Liberian trying to live his life.
Yes. So you have to accept the reality. And I think the tendency here, too, with many of these kinds of issues, unlike what you see in the West, that you can go back and, pull up some old history and say, we're going to prosecute this person, even though it's been 20 years, but they committed crimes, and so we have to prosecute them. In this instance, I think many of these folks are kind of immune from future prosecution, because nobody wants to open this Pandora box. So everybody's going about their own business, quietly, hoping that, everything will be calm and nothing is going to happen.
Well, and the structure of government is really very similar to that of the United States, as you might expect, given the history. So there's a bicameral legislature, there's a Senate, there's a House. So a lot of these people have positions in the legislature.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. It's fascinating to look at the Liberian situation and the whole government, similar branches of government. And as a matter of fact, you are very right. Many of those who were involved in all of this, all of this massacre and all this pillage in the country, are serving either in the House or Senate or the representatives, and they are in government, and they are being paid by government. But I, as an indigenous Liberian to myself, I somewhat understand exactly what is happening here. There's so much fear that, in fact, it's a saying that sometimes if you pull rope, you pull bush. And so if you go, when something has the lid on top, don't go opening it again, because you may just kind of like open up a lot of things that you would not be able to put back in. And nobody wants that war again. The war touched everyone in every sector.
Well, talk a little bit about the economy, the society generally before the Civil War. Liberia was a prosperous place.
Yes. Liberia was a prosperous place. The economy was fairly good compared to many other African countries, including some of the countries in West Africa. The educational system was good. even compared to some of the other countries. You have to understand that Liberia is basically an English-speaking country. And so education, the schools, colleges, high schools taught in English. And things were fine. Yes, it may have not been, such a progress may have not been comparable to what you see in the West or in some of the other far developing countries in Africa, like, Ghana or South Africa. I mean, you couldn't compare them. However, Liberia was pretty good. At the time, too, you're talking about before the war, iron ore, which was one of the major products generated in Liberia, was something that was having very strong market value. Firestone was in high production with rubber.
Rubber was a big industry.
Yeah, rubber was a big industry. And so what you had happening here was that there was a lot of commerce, a lot of good things happening, if you want to put it that way. And many of us who were young at the time and in college was anticipating that it's a good place to live. In fact, Liberia at the time too was a good place where a lot of folks would travel to for vacation and tourism. You could get on a flight, from the Rabat International Airport on the outskirts of Monrovia and go through Sierra Leone and, land in New York the next day. Those things were were things that were happening. They were very good. When the war came, all of those things were shut down. No country wants to fly in, take the airlines in there. I recently read an article in the New York Times that was written by another Liberian, actually forgotten her name, but she works for the New York Times. She wrote a fascinating article on whether Liberia can be viewed as, the new paradise for vacation. And her point here was that it depends, it's in the eyes of the beholder. It depends on how you want to look at it. But she took her grandkids, over, and right now what is happening is that the country is redeveloping, and she showcased, large swimming pools and, very good food, and hotels are springing up. One thing I'm hearing is that electricity is becoming stable in some parts of the country. And so I think there is some development that has taken place over the 12 years on President Salif.
So, one of the things that I think is often overlooked is the impact of a protracted conflict like that on the ability to respond to other challenges. So let's talk a little bit about Ebola and something a great deal about, the healthcare system and the ability of the country to respond to a crisis like that.
Yeah, I think, and I wrote, several papers on this, and I, spoke about this extensively in 2014, 2015. In many of these developing countries, including Liberia, the challenges of providing healthcare is there. It's a difficult process. You have low healthcare manpower resources, not enough doctors per capita, not enough nurses per capita. Hospitals are poorly functioning. And so when you factor in conflicts wherein supplies don't come through the pipeline, it makes it even more difficult. And so we saw this during the Ebola outbreak. I think people have been much more prepared if, in fact, the development that was taking place in the 80s, in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, we had kind of like moved on straight through to now, then the war just decimated many of those hospitals. I used to work at a hospital in rural Liberia called Phoebe Hospital. It's a Lutheran hospital. In fact, that was my first. I call it my first base where I got most of my training initially, and it's about 85 miles on the outskirts of Monrovia. That hospital was damaged during the civil conflict, and that particular hospital served the entire northern and central area. It was like a tertiary hospital, but very good outreach and preventive efforts from the hospital. So when you damage those healthcare systems and you have an ugly disease like Ebola raising its ugly head in that situation, it becomes a very difficult situation to be able to address it. And I will hope that there's some lessons learned from such outbreaks. And I think what I'm reading about now and have learned is that the international community is also not sitting by kind of quietly now looking at these. A couple of months ago, there was reports I heard on the BBC, and there were reports somewhere in, I think, the eastern part of Liberia of, I think, 5 or 6 deaths or something in the remote area. And healthcare workers wasted no time, including even the CDC, and they were on the case within an instant trying to figure out what is this now, because the worst thing to have done again is to sit quietly and let it, because people travel, and besides coming to the U.S., people will travel to the city.
So you mentioned the administration of Nobel laureate now, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was term limited out. She served her 2 terms.
Yes.
And is now leaving. How would you characterize her years in office?
I think it's been a fascinating period of time because, and I would say, if you were to grade her, you would give her excellent, because she inherited a period whereby there was no there was barely any functioning infrastructure. The civil government, in fact, was in disarray. And, many of us admire President Sirleaf's, hard work, but also her work ethics. And, no nonsense kind of woman, during her regime is the first time that many of us began to hear of people being dismissed and being fired for, impropriety, or not doing what they're supposed to do, or for corruption. So I think she's been one of those who has set in place a motion, and I'm hoping that whoever gets elected this time around will be able to, I would say, carry on some of the good work that she put in place.
So what were the issues in this campaign, do you think? I mean, we're talking to your friends and family.
Yeah. They, like we normally say in Liberian politics, government can only do so much is normally what we say. So even many of the issues that was raised had to do with still corruption. Even though, as I understand, President Sirleaf put in place very stringent measures that, you can't take bribery, you can't do this, you can't do that, but those things still tends to happen. There's some of that report that folks are saying that if you get me elected, I will kind of fight against corruption. There's also the issue of poverty. So there's entrenched poverty in a lot of these countries in West Africa. But more so, even within the country, there's also disparities in poverty. So Liberia is a place whereby much of the products being generated is agricultural kind of products, and people live off farming. And the war has this counter effect because during the war, people kind of fled from the rural area and, found themselves in the city. So even many of my siblings, including my own brothers, I keep saying, go back up in the interior, go back to the farm, that our parents left for us. And, they don't want to go back to the farm. Either they've lost their way on knowing how to farm, or is this economic dependency in a sense whereby they want to stay in the city and wait for remittances in order to be able to survive. So whoever gets elected will also have to put in place, how can I get the population to be self-sufficient, either in agriculture, in commerce, small trade. One thing I have always said is that don't forget the youth and the women in the population. Women in many African countries, including Liberia, even though we men probably try to think that we are the head of the household, that's not the case. It is the women. And if you can find a way for these women to be able to generate incomes, that would be a good way for families to be able to survive. Liberia is a place whereby you have a large proportion of young people. When you look at the demographic data, the last I was reading about, it says something like there's almost something like 70% of the country population, the 4.6 million people, 70% is like, youth population. And so, and that's not, atypical in many developing countries in Africa. So this is the force to reckon with. And I think this is where all of this excitement about the elections and everything else came into play, because it is these young people who are finally saying, hey, we don't want corruption, or we want things to be done this way, and we want things to be done that way. You see what happens here in the United States, too, with the young folks stepping up to do things. And that kind of movement is happening all around the world, including Liberia.
So a field of 20, but probably many were not viable candidates anyway and ran for different reasons. Who are the front runners? Who would you guess will likely make it?
Well, there's the information being suggested, even though the outcome of the election is not has not been reported yet. The final outcome has not been reported yet. But the former the current vice president, is for Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, is one of the front runners. And then you have the soccer star, Mr. Weir, being the second front runner.
So it seems like a very different combination. You've got a career politician and a footballer with no previous...
Yes. In politics, as you will be well aware, not only in Liberia, campaigns and one ability to run their campaign and being able to create slogans, or either being able to connect with the population on certain types of issues will get you, to get votes, and will make people to kind of pay some attention to what you are saying. So, he's been able to do that probably very well. This is his third time, the soccer player now, this is his third time attempting to become president of Liberia, as I understand. But yes, the career politician in the mix would be Mr. Buseh, who is the current vice president for President Sirleaf.
So what would you say would be the biggest challenges then for whoever ultimately wins? And just to be clear, in the system, the top two vote getters in the first round, if no one gets a majority, will have a runoff election coming up in November.
Exactly. So it is suggested that you have to have 50 plus one type of vote in order to be able to win the election. So many experts are suggesting that it's very likely to be a runner-up in the next couple of weeks. It remains to be seen exactly what will happen, and I'm hoping that there's no kind of problems as far as counting the ballots and whatnot. But what are some of the critical things to consider going forward for any new administration? One of the first ones I would think would be to sustain the peace. Whoever comes to power must be able to sustain the peace. Liberia is a very interesting country. It's made up of many ethnic groups, many tribes and ethnic groups. In many elections and in many settings in these places, what tends to happen is that elections become all about ethnicity. It doesn't become about what is the agenda that this person is moving forward with. It becomes an issue of ethnicity. And I think the president President Sirleaf did a pretty good job on telling them that, this election should be an election about them and also their families, but not about their tribe and their ethnicity. So I think that's a good thing. The other thing is creating jobs, again, as I said, for these young people. There must be an ability or a way for any new government to try to create some form of job. And I would stress the issue of improving the education system. And I'm not looking forward to saying that everything has to be, pro-academic kind of thing. It could be in the forms of vocational trainings and apprenticeship. And if you can get some of these young people to put to use their knowledge and their skills, that they can be able to generate some income, that would be a very good thing to do. I think health and the healthcare system should be another thing to look at. The 2014 Ebola outbreak in Liberia, in Guinea, and in Sierra Leone, but especially in Liberia, kind of showcased the inefficiencies in the healthcare delivery system in Liberia. When that virus kind of entered into the city, into the slum, all hell broke loose, and you saw how people were dying, and the system was just not prepared for it, and it was overloaded. So training of individuals, nurses, especially so who are usually the frontline individuals would be very important.
Well, we're just about out of time, but I hope who's ever elected has your number. You seem to have good advice for a new administration. Aaron Buseh, thank you very much for joining us once again. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.